Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves a treat. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby.
Hello and welcome to Movies vs. Capitalism, an anti-capitalist movie podcast. I am Rivka.
And I am Frank. And we are back, and this is our first week back since attending the Ambie Awards, which were last week, which are the highest honor in the podcasting industry. Yeah, if you hadn't heard, this show, Movies vs. Capitalism, was nominated for Best Entertainment Podcast. So Rivka and I went out to Los Angeles to attend the awards. What were your thoughts? What were your feelings? I know we've talked a little bit about it, but yeah, what do we want to share? What do we want to share with the fam?
It was so much fun. Our category was sponsored by The Hollywood Reporter. So I think I said this before. It felt a little Trojan horse. I was like, do they know what they nominated?
Our category was Best Entertainment Podcast.
Right.
So you thought what? That we should be
I don't know what I thought. I guess I just thought, I don't know. You don't often see things that are so critical of entertainment be sponsored by The Hollywood Reporter, so it was cool.
You're absolutely right. We are not the typical entry for Best Entertainment Podcast, but I mean, I think honestly, I feel like you and I in this show engage with entertainment and the media and TV and film, like you're saying, in as critical and observant of a way as possible. And if that's not an entertainment podcast, I don't know what is.
I don't know what is. No, you're right.
I feel like we're not only engaging with like content, which I fucking hate saying, but like we are engaging with the very idea of entertainment and the very idea of media and film and art. So like
content engagers. No, it's a great category. I had a lot of fun. I mean, I think what's cool about it is both you and I are fans of podcasting as a medium even before we started our own podcasts. I know we're fans of different types of podcasts. I'm a big true crime fan. And so like there's a podcast, The Girlfriends, that won, and I got to meet the woman from that. So it was just, I was kind of fanning out.
You were very excited about that.
Yeah, and this is such a medium that's like very intimate and you get to know people in such an intimate way. So I was fangirling. It was a lot of fun. It was a beautiful event. We got to bring Rufus Paisley, who did our design, and Jesse Conweiler, friend of the pod, also our dear friends, one of my best friends.
We got to walk the red carpet. We got Getty imaged. We officially
got Gettied.
If
we wanted to pay like $500, we could download the image without the...
Wow, without the watermark. Wow, might be worth it. But I don't even think we said it yet. In case it wasn't clear, we did not win.
We didn't win
our category. We didn't win, but it was very much an honor to be nominated. And I'll say, the one big takeaway that I had was the other shows in our category were, from HBO and from Marvel and other big shows about entertainment. And I think just the very fact that us, a very explicitly anti-capitalist podcast, which in our submission episode, The Matrix with Ren Mac, which you should go back and listen to if you haven't yet. In that episode, we talked about fascism. We talked about Maoism. We talked about, the way that trans folks are on the front lines of class war. We talked about a lot of very radical ideas, concepts, things that I don't think are usually included in stuff that gets nominated for big award shows like this.
That's what I was trying to say with the Trojan horse thing, but you just said it. You articulated it much better.
So I guess all of that is to say that I am extremely proud of the work we put forward because it was clearly of high quality enough that they nominated us for this award, which I think is pretty cool. And I think an amazing testament to what you and I have been able to build over the last year. I'm very, very proud of it. I'm so, so grateful to everyone who listens, all of our subscribers. We love doing this show. Can't wait to keep doing more of it. If we ever get to a place where we have enough paid subscribers where we can sort of just like, this is kind of the only thing we have to focus on, I would love a world where all I was doing was creating more movies versus capitalism.
You're talking the American dream, baby.
The American dream. So on that note, please subscribe to our Patreon.
Please.
But other than the Ambie Awards, you wanted to talk a little bit about what Rami Youssef's SNL monologue.
Yeah. We didn't get to watch it live, and I did not watch the whole. Do you watch? First of all, do you watch SNL anymore? What is your
No,
SNL?
absolutely not.
But you grew up watching. Yeah, no, you grew up watching it though, right?
Grew up watching it. Yeah, my like high school era cast was, like the Will Ferrell, Molly Shannon, Sherry O'Terry, that whole cohort, which was they were great. Yeah, and I think everyone has their own, like their SNL cast that they grew up with, and there have been great casts since then. I think now at this point in my life, I have a different relationship with SNL, having read more about, the way that Lorne Michaels runs the show in a very, from what I've heard tangentially in reporting, a very sort of authoritarian, competitive manner. I'll never forgive Lorne Michaels for having Trump host the year of the 26 election.
Oh my God,
for
that
me,
was
that's
awful.
that's like a tacit complicity in fascism as far as I'm concerned. So I think SNL has a lot of questions to answer, like the institution and Lorne Michaels specifically. But yeah, in terms of today, I don't watch it. Occasionally a clip will make it over to me, but I kind of like don't support it as an institution. So I don't really engage with it. But that's not to say that like if someone like Rami is on, it's amazing that he's getting this platform. It's amazing that he's getting, this exposure. So yeah, and I watched the monologue, which I thought was pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, I sent over your way because I also have little engagement with SNL, but this monologue was making the rounds because Rami said some really amazing, heartfelt, hilarious stuff in his monologue. It was so good. So many things that Rami touched on. So if you haven't watched, it's only 8 minutes. Maybe pause and like go find it and watch, because we're going to get into the meat of it. One of the things, there's many different things. I think most importantly, Rami calls really in a beautiful, heartfelt way for freeing the people of Palestine, specifically connecting it to his friend Ahmed, whose family is over there. He talks about how this is the month of, it's all the things, but it's Ramadan. It's like a lot of holy things happening, but names that it's Ramadan, that his friend Ahmed was asked him to please pray for his family, that his family is over in Palestine suffering incredibly. And he doesn't gloss over it. I mean, he really takes the time to sit with that, I felt, so that it was really impactful. It didn't feel like and I'm going to tag this on at the end. It was sort of, the whole monologue is deeply political, but that's where it leads to.
Yeah, and just also from like a joke writing standpoint, he starts with talking about how he's the one in his friend group who prays for things because all of his friends are, disgusting sinners. So it starts with one friend asking him to pray for his dog who he's trying to get back. And then he kind of couches it there. And then, and it was a brilliant device for him to sort of get his premise set up. And then he was able to say some actually very heartfelt things about freeing the people of Palestine, praying for his friend's family, praying to bring the hostages home, and then got to like tag it at the end and sort of like diffuse the heaviness with some lightness and say, also, my friend's dog, Mr. Bojangles, like, let's try to help him out too, which was very funny. But yeah, I think people were surprised, I think rightfully so, that when he said free the people of Palestine, there was like a sustained applause break from the audience, which is not something that we have seen that much, especially not, we got to assume the SNL audience is like mostly like a standard liberal audience. So I'm curious. I'm curious if that was, there were maybe like some more Rami fans in the audience because he was hosting, or I'm wondering, and actually I think it's more likely that we have gotten to the point where this violence and death and destruction is so unignorable that, him being able to say free the people of Palestine at this point in the conflict in, late March of 2024, people are now coming around to understanding and sympathetic to that viewpoint. So it was heartening to see in that way, as terrible as, what is happening, it still is.
Well, it's interesting you pointed out the audience of SNL, because another thing that Rami brings up in this monologue, which is also in his stand-up special, which is now out, which I haven't seen, but Tommy watched while I was away, which I was pissed about. So he told me, he does that joke in there. I'm like, well, you didn't wait for me to watch it. But he talks about the New York bubble. So, an SNL audience, probably a bit of a New York bubble. I really don't know who comprises that audience, but how there's the South is a myth. really see here I go. Why don't you tell it, Frank? I'm gonna destroy other people's jokes.
No, I mean, I'm not. I mean, no one should ever really try to retell like a stand-up comic's jokes because it's like you're never gonna. But no, it was like the concept was, you know, the South is everywhere. It's not just in the actual South. He's like, I went to upstate New York and there are Trump flags and MAGA hats, and he's like, wait, I went north. How am I in the South?
Right, which just really hit. We both live in this neighborhood. I see him walking his dog, and it makes a lot of sense because I'm in Cobble Hill, and literally you go a block down and you're like, I'm in Trump country.
Yeah, I remember the first time I went to like, you know, Northern California, like Bakersfield, that area, and I was like, oh, wow, this is as non-liberal as you can get, you know? So he's completely right. I think outside of most liberal cities, you know, the more you go into the suburbs, or especially if you go into more rural areas, those conservative areas are going to exist all over the country, not just like not just regionally affixed to the southern states.
Yeah. Another point that I thought was really interesting and kind of brave of him to bring up was he started talking about the Biden administration's pandering towards Arab Americans, and started sort of like bringing up, you know, the elections are coming up, and he has a whole bit about how the Biden administration called him to basically get him to be the guy to like help get Michigan, because Michigan is like Arab America. And it's so funny. And I thought he did such a great job. Nowhere in there, I was waiting and listening like, is this going to turn around? Is he going to turn this into like but we got to vote for Biden? And I didn't feel that at any point it really went there. I thought it was just a straight up joke. I thought he just shed light on the fact that like, yeah, guess what? It's going to be a tight fucking race. And guess who is a determining factor? Michigan.
Yep.
You're massive Arab American, and without a state and without having to say it, the way it was structured, it became like you're sitting there just thinking like, wow, yeah, that's ludicrous to think that sending Rami Youssef there is going to he's gonna like he says he's like, so it's up to me, like, you know, and it's just, I thought it was such a great moment of truth, and hopefully people listening are like, oh fuck yeah, you know what's gonna help you? The only thing that's gonna fucking help you now, Joe, is to like fucking call for a ceasefire. Stop bombing Palestinian men, women, and children. Like that's what I got from that joke. What were your thoughts? I mean, I thought that was like, whoa.
I thought he handled it as judiciously and tactfully as he was allowed to on a, you know, national network TV broadcast. I'm curious if there were other drafts of that monologue that got a little bit more explicit. But no, I thought he pointed out the thing that the Democratic Party does, which is so fucking infuriating, which is, as you're saying, rather than stopping a genocide, their electoral tactics are celebrity endorsement, you know? So I think especially when conservative Republicans are like, God, all the Democrats care about is cozying up to celebrities and getting these big endorsements. Yeah, part of that's fucking true. And a lot of it is just very bullshitty and surface and just trying to like appear cool and with it, as opposed to actually providing like policies that materially impact people's lives. And then he also said he did not endorse Biden. In fact, he said, like, I'm not a fan of either of them. He did such a good job of taking shots while also still being somewhat, I guess, respectful, or
not even respect. I think he just knows. I think it's like the artistry was he just spoke to the right amount of stuff, and the rest is fucking self-evident. But he didn't have to cover or pander himself.
Do you know what it was? It was without anger. It was like without. You know, it was like without like a biting anger, but the critique was still there, which is something
I thought the tone was heartbreak. It was like a deep heartbreak, which
yes,
everyone can relate to. I think no matter how you're processing or understanding or where maybe your political mind is at currently, he understood the heartbreak, and I think that's going to be really important if we want people to connect their brains to their heart. You have to start there.
Yeah. I think so many people don't understand how much pain the Muslim community is in right now. The Palestinian community. I think that pain has not been at the forefront of this conflict over the last 6 months. And
Yes.
I think you're
Yes.
right. It's crucial for us to move past this point of violence into some place of healing or just anything other than violence. But yeah, no, I thought he was ultimately very strong. I'm so glad that he's got this platform. There's just such a vacuum for mainstream Muslim entertainers, and I'm so glad that he is rising to prominence, because I think it's, identity and representation isn't everything, but it is important, and I think he brings a lot to the table. So I was very happy to see it.
Totally.
All right, well, let's get to our conversation today. But before we do, we just want to remind our audience that we do not sell ads on this show. We rely completely on community support to keep the show going. And if you want to support us, you can do that by subscribing to our Patreon account.
For just $5 a month, you get access to new bonus episodes and our backload of bonus episodes. And you help support all the labor that we put into doing this show. We really have a goal of maybe one day being able to just do this show. So you can find our Patreon link in the episode description in your podcast player or by going to mvcpod.com.
Also, if you have a moment, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast on your podcast player so you do not miss any of our new episodes.
We're going to take a break, but we will be right back with our discussion on Little Shop of Horrors with our guest, Alex Hare.
Hey everyone, we've got an amazing organization we want to tell you about called Anti-Capitalism for Artists.
Anti-Capitalism for Artists is an education-based community dedicated to raising the class consciousness of artists.
Their core offering, the 10-week Intro to Anti-Capitalism course, is designed to be accessible to anyone looking to get familiar with a wide range of anti-capitalist concepts and ideas.
They do this by offering an eclectic array of free virtual and in-person events year-round, geared to meet all manner of knowledge backgrounds. Frank and I both took the course in different cohorts, and it really was amazing. You get to meet with a group of people who are interested in anti-capitalism, you build solidarity, and it's also a lot of fun.
Yeah, they put together such an amazing, comprehensive reading list from anti-capitalist writers from all different types of tendencies, from Marx to black radicalism to intersectional feminism to queer liberation to modern-day anti-capitalists. So you really get a firm grounding in a diverse and wide array of concepts.
Artists of all kinds, abilities, and professional statuses are welcome to join A4A's community, where they can learn, build community, and co-create their own events and offerings.
You can learn more, reach out, or support their work by donating at anticapitalismforartists.com or find them on Instagram at anticapitalismforartists.
Love you, comrades. Now back to the show. Today, we are joined by Alex Hare. Alex is a director and writer of theater and film. He's currently developing several new musicals, including A Burning Church. His micro-budget movie musical, Capricorn 29, an anti-capitalist riff on the film Logan's Run, premiered online in 2021. Wow, we have to talk about that. Logan's Run is one of my favorite movies. Other recent directing...
Never seen it.
Really? We have to cover it on
I've heard, yeah.
podcast. It's great. Other recent directing credits include Top Dog Underdog at Stage Center, Louisiana, The Judgment of Quintus, a comedic video game, and the short film We Take Pictures. Assistant credits include Broadway productions of School of Rock and Sideshow. And Alex, I'm so happy to have you on. You're one of the first, and there'll be a few of us who come on from this reading group of Das Kapital that I've been sharing a whole bunch about. But really fun fact about Alex, this is not your first time reading Capital. It is your second.
That is true.
You
So
just loved it so much, just had to dip back in
It's a real
for a second.
page turner. I had to get back into it.
will you actually share a bit about why you're doing this? Why are you doing this? Reading it not once.
No, that's a good question. Well, let's see. I had organized this little reading group in 2021 of Capital. It was, a couple of people, arts workers, over 9 months. We read 100 pages a month, and we met over Zoom and we talked about it. And I had no expertise in it. I just wanted to read it and knew I needed some accountability. And we had great conversations. And then I said, all right, well, that's cool. And I want to integrate that into my life, but I can't imagine reading that again in the next couple of years. And then Chris Myers, who runs Anti-Capitalism for Artists, which is an organization that has, classes, an intro class to sort of leftist theory that I had taken in 2020. He emailed and said, hey, we're doing Capital Volume 1. And I hesitated, and then I thought, it's really just about who you're talking about it with. And it's so dense, it's so complicated, and the way of thinking is so foreign to me that I just felt like it was worth diving in again. David Harvey, who is the main sort of lecturer on YouTube, let's say, of Capital, he says, you just read it again, and then just finish it and just read it again. And I do think I'm getting a lot of stuff out of it now that I missed. I just think it's a rich text and it's fun to do. I mean, I think our reading group is a lot of fun, and I get a lot of joy and pleasure out of reading about obviously intense things like exploitation and what have you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's been interesting because since sharing a bit about this on the podcast, some people have written in to ask about how do you start something like that, and I love hearing that you were just wanted the accountability, wanted a group, a collective to read it through with, particularly people who might be in the same form of labor as yourself or just friends. And maybe we'll link onto this podcast. I shared it with a few listeners, but we can link onto here just some of those resources that you mentioned, because there are Spotify playlists, there's YouTube playlists, like there's ways to just create that little network of accountability for yourself and start having the convos.
Alex, I'd love to ask how you as a theater maker, because I'm always impressed by people who write musicals. From my understanding, one of the biggest undertakings you can take as an artist, as a creator, just because a musical has so many giant moving parts to it. So one, that's amazing that you've written a musical, but I'm curious how you as a theater maker how did you find your way to that anti-capitalist reading group in 2020?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I should say I love musicals. I want to make musicals that push the form forward. And I like them for the reason you just mentioned, that they're so hard and that they require such enormous synthesis. They bring all tracks together: audio, visual, physical, gestural. You have to think about acting. You have to think about design, all of these things. And I enjoy the challenge of that. I also am a film and video editor. And I think that's actually the same job in some ways as directing a musical. You just have all these tracks and the literal tracks that you're looking, at on the screen there. And so, I think that felt to me in my early 20s like a craft that one could commit one's life to and constantly be, learning about and filtering your, stuff back into the work. You have to, learning about languages, you can put that into work somehow, and certainly politics, I think. And I guess I'll say that, I was pursuing directing in my 20s. I co-founded and co-led a theater festival called Corkscrew Theater Festival for 4 years, from 2017 to 2020 rather. And the mission was to lower the cost to entry for early career artists in New York to have fully staged productions, which can be really challenging. It sometimes feels like all you can do is do a reading and then do another reading, and how can you get the resources for that? And so I think working on that, I started to think a little bit more about what the landscape is. And then I guess I got to a place where I felt like my politics had become complacent. And this was around 2020 with everything that brought. And that led me to Chris and Anti-Capitalism for Artists and the Marx Group and all that. And now I guess I think, I want to work on new musicals and films. Those are the things I'm most excited about. And I'm trying to bring my point of view to that, which is a leftist point of view. I don't want to be timidly apolitical as some work is, I think. But I'm also focusing on what these forms do best. And I think a musical, better than anything, maybe, can conjure the inner life of a person, or perhaps can transfer that emotional experience of the inner life to you. And I think the musical we're going to talk about does that in particular.
I'm so excited to talk about this musical with you, especially now knowing your pedigree. So yeah, let's please get into it. Today we are talking about Little Shop of Horrors. Directed by Frank Oz, screenplay by Howard Ashman, based on the stage musical by Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, which is based on the film The Little Shop of Horrors, written by Charles B. Griffith. Just wanted to make sure we got all the credits correct. This film, the movie musical version, stars Rick Moranis, Ellen Greene, Vincent Gardenia, Steve Martin, Tachina Arnold, Michelle Weeks, Tisha Campbell, and Levi Stubbs as the voice of Audrey II. The budget was $25 million. It grossed $39 million worldwide. And the synopsis for this musical, if you have never seen it, which would be surprising, this is the story of hapless, aspiring botanist and indentured servant Seymour Krelborn, who lives and works in a Skid Row flower shop along with his crush, the floral arranger Audrey, and his boss, the exasperated Mr. Mushnick. Seymour's life suddenly changes when he discovers a new breed of flytrap-type plant which brings the shop wild fame and success, but at the cost of feeding the plant what it wants, which turns out to be human flesh.
Oh, yeah.
So ridiculous when you say it all out loud, but it works.
Some historical context for the year that the second film, the filming of the musical, was released on December 19th, 1986. This is actually the first movie that we've covered from this year. So we're 1986. We're halfway through Reagan's second term. In January, the first Martin Luther King Jr. Day is observed. Reagan originally opposed the holiday, citing cost concerns. Very
cool.
Very Reagan. Very on brand. Also in January is the Challenger disaster, when the NASA space shuttle exploded 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members on board. In May, the movie Top Gun is released and becomes a full-blown national phenomenon. In August, a United States Postal Service employee in Oklahoma guns down 14 of his co-workers before committing suicide. In October, the Fox Broadcasting Company launches as the United States' 4th commercial broadcast television network. And in November, we're in the beginning of the Iran-Contra affair, in which it's discovered that the United States has been selling weapons to Iran in secret in order to secure the release of American hostages. And that is 1986. What a year.
Top Gun in the middle of that year really paints the picture. This is like rah rah America. The military is back. Everyone is back. We're secretly selling weapons to Iran, but it doesn't matter because we're back on top and everyone's just got to get out of America's way. That's the vibe.
So Alex, we always like to start by asking our guest, why did you choose this movie for us to watch?
So I appeared in 2 productions of Little Shop of Horrors as a child. When I was 15, in high school, I played Patrick Martin from World Botanical Enterprises, who comes in at the end to get clippings of Audrey 2, the plant, and get them all over the world. So I think a pivotal character for our reading of this with an anti-capitalist lens. And when I was 10, 5 years earlier, at Jewish day camp, I played Bobby, the urchin, which is a made-up character. Instead of the 3 girls as a girl group, we had 10 sort of ragamuffin Jewish street kids running around as the ensemble. And so I was Bobby. And I think it's not uncommon among theater people that I encountered this multiple times. It's just sort of everywhere, and it's produced at all levels: high school, college, community theaters, off-Broadway, regional, Broadway even. And it's frequently being considered for new iterations. There was a film remake that was in development for a long time, I think is dead now, with Scarlett Johansson as Audrey and Billy Porter as the voice of the plant.
Oh, whoa.
Yes, which, who knows? Chris Evans was going to be the dentist, and that could have worked, I suppose.
Wow.
What about Seymour?
Taron Egerton.
Okay, yeah.
So, even in this week, there have been so many headlines about Little Shop. They announced they're rebooting the Roger Corman film. They're trying to do a new The Little Shop of Horrors, a non-musical version. And on The Tonight Show last week, Evan Rachel Wood, who is currently playing Audrey in the off-Broadway revival that's running, she sang Flowers by Miley Cyrus in her Audrey character voice, which is so iconic that she did it on national television, I suppose. Just the idea of an Audrey voice. Sure. And then Jinx Monsoon was announced to be going into the off-Broadway revival as Audrey after Evan Rachel Wood, so doing a drag, a take on Audrey.
Oh, cool.
And so it's just a property that unites so many major players of mainstream culture. This was a precursor to Disney. Ashman and Menken, of course, went on to write Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast right after this, before Ashman died, sadly, untimely, in the early 90s. The movie is produced by David Geffen. The off-Broadway production was produced by Geffen and Cameron McIntosh of the mega musicals, Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals of the 80s. Sesame Street obviously comes into this with Frank Oz and the puppetry. In the movie, you have this SNL and SCTV contingent with Rick Moranis and all these cameos, Steve Martin, Bill Murray, John Candy. And so because of all that, I guess I feel like I take this thing for granted, right? It's so enmeshed in the atmosphere. And I really hadn't thought very deeply about it for a while or looked at it from my current perspective. And then a few years ago, I guess this was 2019, American Theater Magazine reviewed 2 productions, one, the current off-Broadway revival, which was just opening, and a production on the West Coast at Pasadena Playhouse, directed by Mike Donahue, which was a reimagined production. And the writer, the critic, was teasing out some of the anti-capitalist critique here and said something like, I doubt that Alan Menken and Howard Ashman intended for their little spoof of low-budget horror movies to be critique of late-stage capitalism, but, its body is big enough to digest that take, something like that. And on Twitter, Alan Menken responded, and he said, "Thank you so much. it was intended, which I thought was, gently sassy and perhaps understandably so. So I guess since I read that and all this stuff, I've just had it in the back of my head. I should go back to this thing that I knew well from childhood, something that I took for granted that I understood, and just look at what was happening underneath. And I think that is perhaps similar to the way that we, when we're young, take capitalism for granted as the way the world is. We get older, we start to ask questions, and we come to see it perhaps as the peculiar, historically specific mode of political economy that it is.
Oof. That was awesome.
Very good. Very good entree into this conversation.
Yeah, I had no idea about that tweet. That is really fascinating because we're always thinking about, is this something that we're looking at that had no intention and we're altering it? Or did the creatives behind it have the same intentions which we're putting onto it? Frank, were you ever, let's just get this out of the way before we get into the politics, were you ever in any kind of production of Little Shop?
No, I never made it into an actual production. Although, so many standards in here, so many audition songs, Suddenly Seymour. What's the song that Seymour sings to the plant?
Grow for Me?
Grow for Me, yes. Yeah, that was in my binder for sure, ready to go. 16 measures. But no, I was never actually in a production. Riv, were you?
I didn't get into like the middle school production. I think there was some, I was told there was some drama that one of the leads, her mom was on the board of the school, so
always
Damn.
Politics.
All these politics.
Did she get Audrey?
Yeah.
Wow.
But you know what? I could also be conflating that with another production, but somehow in my imagination, this added up to I had a resentment against the show. And my dream role was always Adelaide in Guys and Dolls. And so that was sort of what my eye was on. So I actually did not, this was a lot more of a fresher take because it was not part of it's not on my top 10 musicals, but I loved watching it from this perspective. And it's getting up there.
A lot of people consider it a perfect musical. Some people
It feels cliche now to be like, oh, but of course I would like to be cast as Audrey. Now I understand why everyone would like the chance. But yeah, it's a great musical.
It's a fucking phenomenal musical. And yeah, Alex, I'm so glad you brought up the idea of revisiting this one because you're right. This musical, it feels so totemic in the pantheon of, modern musical theater that it's like, we don't even talk about it. It's like, we all know it so well, we don't even need to discuss it anymore. And, I remember watching this movie a bunch as a kid. I don't even remember why. It must have been one of those movies that was just always on TV. And, as I was sitting down last night to rewatch it, I was like, okay, Little Shop of Horrors, like we've seen it a bunch. It's, it's like, it's kind of old, it's kind of stodgy. And then like 2 minutes into it, I was like, oh, that's right. This fucking slaps. This is so good. It remains so entertaining, so light on its feet. It moves so quickly. It's like the tunes are so catchy, as Rivka was saying earlier, cannot get them out of her head. They are driving her off the wall. But I was so glad to get the chance to revisit it because it's just on its face, it's an incredible musical. But then for the the reasons that we're going to talk about it here today, it checks all of the boxes politically. Maybe not everyone. Well, I have some critiques. I'm sure we have some critiques.
Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe before we dive into politics, there's just a couple of aesthetic things that struck me watching it again. And I hadn't seen the movie in a long time, but I think what we're all responding to, the score is terrific. Ashman said he wanted it to sound like the dark side of Grease. And I think it does that, through the doo-wop and the sort of early rock sound. And I think just digging into it in the last couple of weeks, I've just been really inspired by reading about the development of it. Ashman gets a lot of moving tributes from Menken and Ellen Green as being just sort of a brilliant person and very determined and very clear about what he wanted from the show. And, he had directed the original production. I don't think I knew that. In that way, he really feels like an author of this thing who's haunting it. And I'll just say that, you watch it, I'm really struck by Skid Row, that opening number, after the sort of prologue of Little Shop, which, I watched and, they finished it and I really, really cried because I'm a sap and I think that's just musicals allow me to feel things that I don't feel otherwise.
Hearing songs like that, especially songs that we have like historical connection to, for me, like I feel tap into a well of emotion that like, it's just like instantaneous sometimes.
Yes, no question. And I think just sort of the art direction of this movie really honors the origins of it on stage, because I think, we feel that it's a stage set, or we feel that we're on a set. it's not quite Sesame Street, but it's a little grittier than that. But I think we see, even when the subway goes by and it looks kind of flat, and all that. I just think all of that stuff helps us feel like this is a constructed world where we believe that people will sing from. There's a sort of marrying of sincerity with ironic distance that it reminds me of Far From Heaven, which was a really important movie to me as a teenager. I feel like Todd Haynes in that movie balances those things so well. And I think Ellen Green is really the epitome of finding sincerity in the sort of exaggerated ironic distance. So I think Frank Oz does that with his direction and the cinematography and all that. But that's just something that I'm carrying with me about Little Shop.
No, I think that's spot on. I was going to ask how you would describe the genre tone of this, because I've heard a few different ways of saying everything from it's satire to it's camp. It's a horror movie musical, but none of those things seem to really capture what it is because of the realism and the depth, which I think is part of the reason looking at it through an anti-capitalist lens and all the grittiness really thrives, because it's, how would you describe it?
Yeah, I don't know. I do feel like those words don't quite do it for me. I feel like to describe it as camp, generally we try to think of camp as being something that we can name after the fact that was not maybe part of the original intention. And this, I think, very consciously, I think they're going for something that feels just like really vivid, really lifted, but still has that kernel of truth to it. So, I don't know. I think that's what I have to offer about describing it. I don't want to put too many names on what it's called. I just think sometimes, this is a little tangent, but Anne Bogart's a theater director, and she talks about how, there was a guy who worked on Miami Vice, and his job was just to look at a costume or a setting or a location or whatever, and to say, that's Vice. Or to say, that's not Vice. So I think that's something that we do in theater, is to say that's part of the world, that's Vice of the world that we're trying to make in a play, or that's not Vice. So I think that's Little Shop. We can look at Ellen Green and say that's Little Shop, and we can look at somebody who's not tapping into the sincerity of it or not exaggerated enough and say that's not Little Shop,
I love that answer.
You're talking about a vibe coordinator.
Yes.
Which is that's a union position on most film and TV sets.
Should be.
I also love, I agree with everything you said. There's something so like tangible and tactile about this set that this thing is produced on and shot on. My partner and I were just watching the new Mean Girls musical, based on the stage musical, based on the film of the same name. And it wasn't really working for us, the Mean Girls musical. And we were like, the music's all right. Like the cast seems really strong, but like, what is it? And I was like, they really shot it like a movie. Like this is really, really polished in a way that like big theatrical film productions can be, but it doesn't have any of that like tactile, like we are people on a stage doing a musical together feel that like this movie is able to, and a lot of movie musicals from this time.
Before we jump into this movie, I just wanted to talk about the history of like the origin movie, the first Little Shop, because I thought it has some interesting political roots. So it was this 1960s sort of they called it a B horror movie, created, meaning like produced and directed by Roger Corman, who was sort of known for making what people called B movies. But Corman really pushed back and insisted these weren't B movies, that he operated outside this major studio sort of double feature model. But it was an interesting time because Corman came out of the Great Depression. This was the 50s, 60s when traditional Hollywood system was crumbling. And so Corman's method basically became all about, he just was known for shooting as fast as possible, for as minimal a budget as possible, for the most surplus value as possible. So that was the whole deal. And there was a rumor, I don't think it was true, that this story came out of sort of a bet that he could do his cheapest, most efficient film yet, which I think is interesting, that this sort of anti-capitalist origin comes out of trying to make something super, like trying to make the most capital off of a film. But that's a bit about like the origin of this. And then it sort of became this cult classic that the creators of the movie we're about to talk about and the creators of the musical would have been watching on TV as kids themselves. So I think that's really interesting. But I was fascinated. I was like, wow, it came out of this desire literally to make a massive profit.
Yes, and I think that I romanticize the Corman way of working because I think so often, especially now in filmmaking, you get so bogged down in all of these different cooks who need to be involved in the kitchen in the making of something. But like you're saying, there is the darker side of this, and I didn't know this. This is just from Wikipedia. I think this is true, but who knows? But just to say that he shot it really quickly, in part because I guess there were changing industry rules that would mean that they would have to pay actor residuals, if they didn't finish it by December 31st, 1959. And so he said, all right, let's do one more like I do them in December of 59, and then the rules will change and we'll figure something else out, I guess.
Wow.
Wow.
Amazing.
And this is what came out.
Right. Contradictions, I suppose.
Contradictions, truly. I know, Alex, you said you had a pretty, I think you said Marxist take on this. So I'm really interested in like how have you been processing this movie at this moment for yourself?
Well, I think the common interpretation of this, even from Mencken in interviews and from directors, is this is a film and a show about greed, and it's about the American dream and the dangers of, the Faustian bargain, promising fame and success and love and encouraging personal gain at all costs, And in that way, maybe Audrey 2 is a kind of portrait of Dorian Gray, representing like the ugly transformation that's going on inside that no one sees. And I think that's valid, and I think that's there and chill. And at the same time, I think I'm just interested in all these other implications. I just guess I found that Audrey 2 is a very rich symbol that we can read in many, many different ways. And so, I don't know, I have a few that I'll lob at you and see how you take them here. I mean, the first one really is just to think, okay, is Audrey 2 capitalism? And there's an interesting YouTuber who had a video about this. His name is Dan Drambles. And he talks about these B movies, these invader movies, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers and The Blob, and how these were so often communist allegories, right? The danger, the threat to middle America is communism, is coming in the 50s and 60s. And so to think that this is actually about capitalism feels like an interesting, refreshing twist on that genre. And I guess I feel that Audrey 2 and Seymour in many ways represent that capital relation between capitalist and wage laborer, this plant that keeps growing. It needs to keep growing. I think we know that capitalism, thrives on continuity and you can't pull out the money of the process. It's no longer capital, right? Capital really is value in process, the exchange of that value that needs to keep moving. Otherwise, you're just a miser who has taken the money and buried it in the ground, let's say. And I guess I want to quote a little bit of Marx.
Let's do it.
Okay. And I think actually, Rick, you had clocked this in a previous session of the reading group, but in chapter 10, The Working Day, which is a really, blockbuster sort of chapter, a lot of history in that chapter, he describes capital as, quote, dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks. And then he also says that, capitalists are always trying to elongate the working day and make people work longer hours. And so that elongation, while effective, quote, only quenches in a slight degree the vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. And Marx warns that the vampire will not lose its hold so long as there is a muscle, a nerve, a drop of blood to be exploited. So I'll just offer that. I don't know how much unpacking that really needs, but it felt, really targeted here.
I'm all right there with that. What were your thoughts, Frank?
Yeah, it's funny. Before we started recording, I was like, is anyone going to have like a fresh, interesting take on like the anti-capitalist read of Little Shop? Because it feels very straightforward. Like you're saying, Alex, like Audrey 2 could just be the manifestation of capitalism itself, the concept. It could be representative of like the profit motive, specifically the need to ever increase profits. It could be, and what I kind of landed on was it felt more like Audrey 2 is capital accumulation. The capital's need to constantly accumulate and reinforce itself just because, like in this movie, Audrey is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So yes, just sucking more of the labor and you can like mix metaphors here, but whatever life force Seymour has, and then ultimately the moral and ethical sacrifices that not sacrifices. Sacrifice means like you're doing it selflessly. The moral and ethical crimes he commits to keep feeding this capital. Yeah, so I thought it could kind of go in a bunch of different directions. Riv, what was yours?
I was very much on that vampire, like seeing it through that literal lens, which I thought was really just such a great, clear image for how capital works and grows. And I think what's great is that because it's grounded in the material circumstance, the first thing we hear is actually the beginning, which says who is saying this? It's just narrator voice,
Just
right?
the
Or
voice. Yes, the narrator
just
voice.
the voice. So we assume the big person in the sky. On the 21st day of the month of September, in an early year of a decade not too long before our own, the human race suddenly encountered a deadly threat to its very existence. And this terrifying enemy surfaced, as such enemies often do, in the seemingly most innocent and unlikely of places. So that opens and you're like, okay. What I think is interesting about entry point like that is you could put anything, like you were saying, Alex, that could be communism. That could be whatever enemy you want. You could perceive this film through that lens. But then when we go in and the opening, we have this great chorus. It's introducing us to Skid Row, to the material circumstances. It makes a point to show us the place of desperation that all of these characters are coming out of. You know, the first sort of capitalist relationship we're introduced to is Mr. Mushnick, who owns the plant shop in Skid Row. And that Seymour has already been taken advantage of and exploited since being a child, because he was pulled out of the orphanage, which he was in because of these material circumstances. And I think there's immediately like not a judgment of like these are individual cruel people. You're just being the first bad actor that we're introduced to is the environment, is the circumstance, which I think is useful for informing this anti-capitalist point of view, as opposed to this is just another tale about like bad, greedy people. And then we see like Mr. Mushnick takes Seymour in as an orphan to work in his shop. Basically child labor, and Seymour, it's like all Seymour knows. Seymour's hasn't really put the pieces together because he thinks, well, this is my dad. He was so nice to me, but he lets off that like he's been working for him. He's allowed off every other Sunday.
He is a straight up indentured servant. That is what Seymour is when we meet him at the beginning.
Yeah. And so even and we'll get into Audrey's character more, but I think because they make a point to set up that world, and as you said, it's a really moving song, Alex, like that tells me that there's a consciousness of something greater. So when Audrey comes in, like Audrey is coming and exploiting this world the way capital exploits already whatever disparity is here. That this isn't
Audrey
like
2.
Oh, sorry, Audrey 2. Audrey 2, not to be confused with Audrey 1.
Very important distinction to make in this movie.
Audrey 2, the plant, is set up then, you know, in the way that I also read it, as the embodiment of capital, to be like a vampire, which is dead, take advantage of this life and just suck everything out of it. And it makes it harder to just see Seymour as someone who's giving into his own inherent selfish nature when you understand he's been abused and an indentured servant since childhood. So I thought that was really important.
And Ashman and Menken make the smart choice where Audrey 2 doesn't just make Seymour cool or like make him popular or like get the girl or like any other character attribute that could like easily be changed through the magic of this plant. No, like in this movie, Audrey 2 provides like material gain, like actual wealth, like business is booming. And I think that's a very intentional choice to say that like this plant isn't just making you cool or more likable. It's making you materially wealthy.
I mean, along these lines, I think another reading of Audrey 2 is not as capitalism itself, but preying on capital's victims, right? You know, coming down and seeing that, you know, these people, Seymour in particular, is so exploited by Mushnick, who, you know, we might call like an aspiring capitalist, right? He's like what Marx calls a small master, has only 2 employees and you know, wants to be better at exploiting, I suppose. And then, yes, you know, it really makes Seymour work all hours. I guess I feel like, you know, we see something about the elongation of the working day in the way that Mushnick treats Seymour, because the plant arrives and then Mushnick says, you know, you better stay here. You know, I'm going to leave and you figure out how to, you know, nurse this plant back to health. And then the more successful it is, the more Seymour has to be there at night when nobody's looking and doing these grisly deeds, you know. So it just feels like there's something about the working day there. And I guess Mushnik in the show, not in the movie, has a song called Mushnik and Son, where essentially the plant is becoming so successful and Seymour might be wooed away to work for someone else or to go off on his own. And so Mushnik sings Mushnik and Son, which is to say, hey, why don't we become partners and I will adopt you? And that's a way of, in a sinister way, though it is kind of played for laughs, a way of keeping him in the fold and abusing this blurred line between family and business, I guess, that the two of them have.
Well, I thought most businesses were families. That's what I've always been told.
He has that one line in the movie where he's like suddenly calling Audrey and Seymour, my family, let's go out to eat. And I picked up on that exactly like you're saying, Frank, how I perceive like Google and companies like that are like, we're a family. We're a great, let's pretend that this is not about capital at all. And we will actually have your back. You may not have good health care, but I love you like a son.
And I might throw a couple more here, as long as we're talking about Audrey 2 at you. We just read this chapter about machinery, or we're in the middle of this chapter in Capital Volume 1 about machinery. And I guess I just see certain parallels, like Audrey 2 as a machine, coming in with the industrial age as the embodiment of capital, endowed with this consciousness and will. Audrey 2 sings, I'm your willing slave, but in fact is more like the master, in Marx's terms, who relates to the workers as hands. We just read this, and I was just like, well, Seymour is so much about his hands, really reduced to his hands and the physical toll that it takes on his fingers. Machinery came in and it flipped the dynamic between the worker and the tools. The machine makes use of the worker rather than the worker makes use of the tools, and the worker is dependent. That just feels like Seymour and Audrey too. And, along these lines, there is a kind of de-skilling of the worker that we see when the machine comes in, right? And I guess I was thinking this morning about Grow For Me, where essentially that's a list song, right? And he's saying, here's all the things that I've done for you, and increasing levels of, I don't know, complexity or expertise or knowledge. I've tried you at levels of moisture from desert to mud, and I've given you grow lights and mineral supplements and all this stuff. It just feels like he has a passion and a knowledge, and then the plant reduces him to just his blood, which certainly requires no genius, although John Candy's radio host calls him a genius. He has been de-skilled. He's reduced to this sort of supplementary repetitive motion, I guess. That's just something that I feel like is in the air as well.
That's a really strong. Yeah, he's reduced to Blood Boy. He's the original Blood Boy. Way before it was cool with the billionaires.
That boy. Yes. Oh God. Yeah.
No, I love all of these. I love all of these points that you're bringing up, and again, it speaks to the brilliance of this movie, that like this metaphor really can be read in these different ways, but not as communism. I think we're right, and I think Mencken was right when he clapped back saying like, no, this was intentional. And, just in the beginning in Skid Row, the second number, a line that I had never heard before jumped out was, the bosses take your money and they break your hearts. I mean, that is very clearly about exploitation. That is about the way that surplus value is taken by the capitalist class from the workers. So I think all of this intentionality is like definitely there. And again, I loved it. I was blown away by it.
Well, there's something interesting about even making these, I guess, anti-communist propaganda B-movie horror things, but just the anxiety of like what comes out when you're trying to write a horror movie. It's actually the fact that this came out of that. It's like there's something fascinating that you're actually getting out your anxieties of the reality that you're really living in, which is capitalism. And we just see that happening all the time now. You could look at so many things that a far right is scared of and angry about, and you're like, you're scared of capitalism, you're scared of what's happening now, but you're wrapping it up in this monster that doesn't exist, like this Red Scare communist thing. So I think there's something really significant about the fact that Little Shop came out of maybe that part of Corman's imagination,
and that Mencken and Ashman in the 80s were teasing this stuff out even more. It feels like, I don't know, we don't know exactly what their politics were. I don't know that I've seen that specified, but clearly this has a sort of liberal leftist take on it anyway, and yeah, I don't think we're taking a leap to say that the political point of view it was coming out of sort of generally.
Well, now, Frank, they did do Newsies, right? Or Alan Menken did, right?
Mencken did do Newsies, yes.
And I gotta say, we've covered Newsies, and we've decided it's one of our favorite political films. So
Near perfect politics.
I'm guessing Mencken. I'm guessing and hoping Mencken's politics were.
Yeah.
Damn,
yeah.
do we have to get Mencken on the podcast? If anyone knows Alan Mencken, please send him our way.
I'll work on that.
That would be very cool.
I got two more little Audrey 2 ideas here, and then we
Please.
can talk about
Go
anything
off.
besides Audrey 2. But we got to talk about the commodity fetish, because I think I've even seen one or two people who are coming to this from a Marxist point of view who say, oh, Audrey 2 is a really great symbol for the commodity fetish. And this is a concept that I think I am just continuing to refine my understanding of, having come back to Capital, after a year and a half away from it. And so, Rivka, feel free to add or correct me, in some of this as I offer this take here.
Yeah.
But
Well, you've climbed the mountain 1.5 times. I am halfway.
well, I guess I think, the commodity fetish is this mistaken view of the things that we buy as just being sort of natural or organic or magical. They appeared for us, and in that way, we're failing to see the labor that went into creating it. And when it appears in this song called Dadu, it appears out of nowhere during a total eclipse of the sun, and Seymour buys it for $1.95, and now it's a commodity, right, that he has, exchanged. And he thinks it's this magical thing. It wasn't there before. How did it get there? And then he learns what it needs to survive, which is his labor and his blood. And then people come into the shop, and it's not really a commodity anymore. It's an attraction, I guess, that draws people to buy things at the shop. But they don't see the flesh and the blood that Seymour puts into it, and they don't see, as he attains more success, the bodies that he serves up to this thing. They just see it as natural, especially because it's a plant. They think it's a natural sort of thing. I guess I feel like in the Corman film and in the stage show, at the end of both of those, the faces of the victims appear in the blooms of Audrey 2, which is a
Ooh.
kind of reveal of the lie of the commodity fetish, right? We see the bodies that have been objectified or congealed in this thing. So to me,
Yeah.
that feels like, just a compelling take on it. I had read, just a couple of people throwing that into the pot in terms of interpretation.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I was thinking about how in this film shows us how capitalism hides under nature, which is what you're getting at. And that was a great description of commodity fetishism, that it's so much of it is like we're not taught to question the water. It's just the water we're in, the air we breathe. And why would you be scared of a plant? Like, it came out of the earth. This is natural. It's natural to want to feed capital. Like, these are just natural parts of us. And if something is wrong with it, that's also part of human nature, right? This greedy part of us is part of human nature, and part of our work and part of the project of being, anti-capitalist in whatever form that takes is to question and to look at, like, that is actually not natural. That is a system put upon us. And if we reconnect with our own natural instincts, natural intuition, we might be able to fight that. So I love that it came out as a plant.
There's something about the relationship between man and nature that, again, I think Marx is talking about as being beautiful and necessary. We have the stuff of the earth, and we have to use it, and we give and take and that sort of thing. And then capital, takes it and creates this particular exploitative relationship around it. And in that way, and this is kind of my last, theory about Audrey 2, as sort of nature's revenge on man for doing capitalism, you can imagine, for climate change or for eating up the natural world and the raw materials, a plant is sort of beating capitalism at its own game and trying to take back the earth. And I guess that points to, the alternate ending, the director's cut ending. But it feels like, somebody could do a really eco-conscious production of Little Shop, and that might fit,
Back to what you were saying about the faces appearing in Audrey 2 towards the end. What I did appreciate is that as Audrey grows, which is to your point about how capital grows and the industrial system and like these forces becoming bigger, Marx uses the word cyclopean a lot, which I love, just like massive. And we see that in, anytime you engage with capitalism thinking, I got this, I'm in charge, which I think a lot of people think, and you're like, you are not. Once you engage in the system has you, again, like a vampire. That visual of this monstrous plant growing. And then there's the little Audrey monsters that are growing out off of Audrey 2's hands, Audrey 2 monsters. I just love that image because I think it's so great. You're like, it's just once it starts, it can't stop. And again, it's like coming out of this imagination of like communism or fear, but none of that makes sense. Like, I just don't even see how you see that as a fear of communism. Like, it just does. It's not even logical. It seems now, once you see it this way, so logical that it is this compulsive capitalist being. I don't know. I didn't do any research into where I'm sure there's a ton of information here, and maybe you know some, Alex, about where the images for Audrey 2 were generated from.
And I don't know about the complexities of the development of the design, but Martin P. Robinson is the main puppeteer from Off-Broadway, and then I think he worked on the film as well, and he's a Sesame Street person. And so many people who Menken and Ashman came to for the Off-Broadway production said, no, you could never do that, because the Off-Broadway production, and then all productions really subsequently, except for reimagined ones, have 4 plants. You know, there's a little one, and then there's like a bigger one that's still sort of a hand puppet, and then there's, you know, a little bit of a larger one, and then there's, you know, the massive one. And this guy was just like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And he did, and he talks about how he was like ripped when he was doing this because he had to be in the plant and like manipulating it, and you know, a younger or an older man really maybe couldn't do it. But there's a lot of human labor, I think, in the doing of Audrey 2 when it's in theater. And then in this movie, there were 50 plus puppeteers ultimately who manipulated Audrey 2. And, you know, of course, you imagine that if this were remade, they would use some combination of CGI. And of course, VFX workers are workers too, and they are criminally underpaid and overworked. And we've seen, you know, stories about that from Marvel and what have you. But there is something really beautiful about knowing that all these people, you know, were, you know, doing something tangible in creating Audrey 2. You know, they were all in the same place and they were working together, you know.
That's really interesting, just in terms of if your future productions revealing like all the human labor behind, revealing the puppeteers, really revealing the labor as it's happening, so you could see the sweat, you could actually reveal that, so it's not part of that illusion, how that would affect this telling of this story.
I want to talk about, if it's okay, if we're done on Audrey 2, I would love to pivot to Audrey 1 for a second. Because I was really taken this watch again by Ellen Greene, who I learned in researching this was the original Audrey in the original Off-Broadway production. So she originated this role. I found Audrey more interesting and compelling than Seymour on this watch. And I feel like we get more shades and more dynamics of how someone, particularly, you know, a female presenting person in this time, what kind of pressures the system is putting on her. Specifically, that when we are introduced to Audrey, one of the first things we learn about her is that she is in an abusive relationship, that her boyfriend has been hitting her. And she makes it very, very clear from the top that like she is in this because he makes good money. He is a professional. He's got a job. And, you know, it's a dynamic that very sadly we see in this system where, you know, women, or not just women, but people tolerate domestic abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse for the hope of economic security. And I just thought that was so compelling and poignant right off the bat to see specifically Audrey saying, like, I'm putting up with this abuse with the hopes that it will provide economic security in the future, which I thought, again, was another just really, really strong message that they laid out right in like the first like 10 minutes of the movie.
Yes, and I think she also feels she doesn't deserve better, right? She and Seymour have both really internalized this low self-esteem, which I think is derived from their social and class standing. And in Suddenly Seymour, she sings, you know, for losers like I've been, it's so hard to say. We get a little bit of biography about her. She was raised by a single mother, poor single mother. She has at times had to work multiple jobs. You know, when the shop wasn't making money, she talks about how she worked at the Gutta. You know, she met Oren at the Gutta, you know, the night spot, where she put on cheap and tasteless outfits, not nice ones like these, you know, and she's wearing whatever she's wearing. I guess I'll mention, this is a little tangent, but some people now are wrestling with, you know, the presentation of Audrey in productions. You know, there was a UK production where they consciously dressed her not sexy, and they wanted to take that part out of Audrey, which I guess I think feels like a fine choice, but not a mandatory one, right? I mean, we feel like she that's her self-expression. I mean, the fact that, you know, that line I just quoted, you know, she loves how she looks. She loves what she wears. And I guess, you know, there's a little question about Suddenly Seymour that I had listening to it. Now I think maybe inevitably we hear, you know, this song about, you know, a man who's maybe saving her. It's sort of a religious thing. Seymour purifies her. And, at the beginning, he's saying, take off this makeup. You don't need that. And I think we hear that. And maybe that feels a little bit like a cliche now, like, girl, you don't need makeup, and like, she can wear makeup. But at the same time, I'm curious about what the two of you think about that. But I also think ultimately, that song is the two of them meeting each other and saving each other. And in the movie, at least, it feels like it really is one woman's epiphany. And Seymour is kind of a mirror that's reflecting her self-worth back to her. It just in the staging, and this feels like the classic staging to me. It's really Ellen Green's song, and then Seymour and the girls are backup, and that way I just find it so moving. And then other productions, I think this current off-Broadway revival tries to make it a little more of an even thing. And I think that works too. I think Seymour is so dispossessed, and it's really, the two of them coming together. It doesn't feel like a patriarchal narrative. It's just that, maybe on the literal surface of some of the lyrics, we might hear echoes of that.
I did, and I'm glad you brought that up, because on this watch, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I was like, why does she need Seymour? Like, why is Seymour is going to come along and just fix everything for her, and she's going to have this epiphany because of Seymour, and she's going to suddenly see her self-worth because of Seymour. I guess maybe you're right. Maybe that's just some of the lyrics stuff.
I've been loving seeing different actresses' interpretations of this coming up from the different song, and you see how much can change based on interpretation and how deep one can go. And I do think Ellen Green's is still the top. This is where the contrasts in this world are so profound in terms of genre, and probably why it is so fascinating to keep generating different versions and keep exploring and keep doing different productions, because the more you highlight the reality of the abuse, which is highlighted in the film, but also contrasted with a lot of the bigger sort of satirical or, the heightened sort of dark Sesame Street world of it, which I like. But then the more real you get in those moments where you're like, damn, this woman they're not fucking around. She's getting violently abused. And I thought it just had a lot to say about the roles of patriarchy. And then when I guess it was hard not to see, looking through this anti-capitalist lens, of how much those roles are demanded from the system, how much those roles are demand you play them in the system. And that's part of where there's no escaping. I think it's interesting also, I loved Audrey Singh's Somewhere That's Green. And it just says a lot about the limits of imagination under capitalism, how much capitalism holds your imagination. The best dream she can have is dictated by better homes and gardens. And everything inside of that this is the best dream. And there's something that maybe originally you can, when you're in it in the 60s, but it's fascinating seeing it from this lens of the 80s. There's you get the sense that they know this isn't great either, that this is not actually, there's an irony to the dream of the better home and garden.
It's even more fake than the other sets that we've seen so far.
Yes.
There's another layer of artifice that they've put on the fantasy sequence.
Yes. And it makes so much, you see that now is only under capitalism are you well, my dreams will be fulfilled by spending more money and getting into debt for this because this material thing will make me happy. That's the solution to getting out of here. And we can actually see that that's the real horror film from the outside, is that is not the solution. And I love that in the last image of the song, it's her in her imagination. It's her and Seymour with a tiny Audrey and Seymour watching TV, and they're watching I Love Lucy, but they're watching the famous factory scene. And I just thought that was also another nice ode to, because that's a classic. You could look at that through a Marx lens as well. It's the factory workers and the laborers, and that's another classic scene.
No, you're certainly nailing it in terms of the satire. I mean, I think, it was written in the 80s, and we would recognize, a lot of the things that she wants, the lyrics are full of brand names, right? And so this is a consumerist fantasy that she has. And, the pine sol scented air is such a beautiful, horrible, poetic image there. And so much of the fantasy is dictated by television, right? So they have frozen dinners and they watch Lucy. And then, she has these lyrics at the end. I'm his December bride. He's father. He knows best. Our kids play Howdy Doody, which is, I think, 3 TV references. So Howdy Doody, Father Knows Best as a sitcom. And then one that I had not heard of until, I started looking into it now is December Bride, which I think was a sitcom in the 50s about a woman later in her life trying to get married again.
Oh,
And that resonates with Ellen Green's take on Audrey. I mean, Audrey really was shaped by Ellen Green. Her and Ashman came up with the character together in a way, and she brought the wig and she shaped the wig. And Ashman was like, I don't know about this wig. I think she should just be brunette. And she was like, no. And she had a vision. And so that comes from her. And the idea that she's a little over the hill, I think that that's there. I think I'll just mention that she played this role in her early 60s. Back in 2015, opposite Jake Gyllenhaal at a concert produced by Encores.
thought you were about to say she's in her 60s in the movie. I was like,
No.
And pause. What is she?
Yeah. No. She was in her 30s in the movie. She's in her 60s or maybe early 70s by now. And, you just watch her do this. And it just adds to the pathos of it, I think, to see her as a December bride, do Suddenly Seymour. And really just to watch her continue to refine and to discover anew every time the sincerity within the exaggerated gestures that she gives here. I guess I'll mention I created a YouTube playlist of little clips of things that I just might put in my Instagram bio for people to, if you want more Little Shop, to just dig into, because there's so much that's so fun to look at. Some things I've mentioned, some things maybe we'll keep mentioning, but there's a performance of her and Jake Gyllenhaal doing Suddenly Seymour. That's just so moving, and you must watch it.
Oh,
Wow.
hell yeah. Can't wait to watch it.
Yeah, we can link that into the show notes.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Great. And then maybe just to touch real fast on Somewhere That's Green a little bit more, I think you're right that, we look at this and we say, oh, it's a little silly, all these signs and symbols of the good life that she's receiving from dominant consumer culture. We see through that. But of course, there are all of the things that we, look at in our contemporary society and we say, oh, those are the signs and symbols of the good life for us. And I think in that way, an actor has to find the sincerity and the real yearning for love within this. I think, some actors maybe go a little too far. One person I wanted to highlight who's also on the playlist is Joy Woods, who was an original urchin in the off-Broadway production and then replaced as Audrey. And she gives just a very open, sincere performance. And she has this amazing special effect where at the climax of the song, she has two perfect little tears that descend down her face, and she just keeps singing. And it's so, you just feel like towards the end, especially for a Black actress, the vision of housing and fantasy that she's painting is even further away. I might add that this is a song about housing. She has a vision of a tract house.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's something that for millennials and Gen Z, we feel, we understand, that feels so far away to own a house in that way. That's been exaggerated. But I guess this is something I remember from doing it growing up. There's a line in the stage version right before she sings where she says, oh, I just want a little place off the interstate, nothing fancy like Levittown, And at the time, I'm sure I asked the director, like, what's Levittown? And they were like, oh, it was like, whatever, it's housing, But to think about Levittown as this sort of suburban development post-World War II, of identical houses built very quickly via an assembly line, targeted maybe at World War II veterans at first, and importantly, segregated, right? Racially exclusionary. A couple of years ago, I read that book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, that popular book about segregation and housing. And he talks about how the Federal Housing Authority explicitly made sure that tract housing developments like Levittown had to be segregated. And so when you see Joy Woods do it, when you see Michaela J. Rodriguez, who played it at Pasadena Playhouse, a trans woman of color, the dream just feels so far away. And I think that's something that speaks to, Rivka, what you were saying. This is a living, breathing thing, and to have different people take it, there are dimensions that can be, taken advantage of, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's spot on, because what I was like, the dream is class mobility. And you're right. Like the farther you get away from the white experience at that time and the farther you get away from that, you're right. It feels farther and farther away because it's just a dream about mobility. It's a dream about escaping the circumstances and conditions of poverty. And Rivka, I loved your point also. It's also one of very limited imagination, especially for this time, like this musical set in the 60s. So like the dream is simply like the nuclear family advertisement that, everyone was seeing in magazines and on the television at that time. There's no imagination. It's a fantasy and a dream that exists very specifically within the parameters of like American middle class capitalism. It's not imagining a new world. It's like very much it's within the confines, because that's all of these people, all of the characters are just like, I am stuck in this system. I am only trying to get from like one level to the next level rather than figuring out how to break out of the system, because it's a dream and you understand that it's her dream, but you as the audience are like, this kind of looks like it sucks. I don't want this. And I that felt kind of intentional like this myth of class mobility and of finding yourself in the American middle class, like actually, it's not going to give you all the satisfaction and validation that you were originally looking for.
Yes. And I think it has a real payoff in the, let's call it the official ending that people know if they've seen the movie, not the director's cut ending, which we should talk about, because, they have a happy ending. Seymour and Audrey get married, and they arrive at their house, which, like you're saying, is very obviously constructed, this tract house, which I think reinforces its own falseness as an ending and as a happy ending for the two of them. That plus that little plant, that little Audrey 2 that's growing in their front yard, those things suggest that there's something pernicious about this American dream, right? It's built on racial segregation and maybe an exploitative assembly line division of labor, that builds these houses very quickly, that this is a way of creating a community that, has no walkability and the services are limited and it doesn't have those things that urban environments can offer. It feels very, segmented and that sort of thing. So that's me defending the official ending, momentarily, and we can talk about the director's cut, which has so much in it, I think.
I agree. I feel like that Audrey 2 is just, without the little Audrey 2 at the end, it's a trash ending completely. But but it does so much. It does so much to just highlight the eeriness of, exactly like you said, this plastic facade that we know Capital will find new ways of exploiting. And in some ways, that's actually a really interesting ending to show us not the total destruction, but the hint of Capital will find you, will meet you where you're at. You didn't actually, like a weed, you didn't destroy anything at its roots. You didn't take care of the system. You just got rid of one head of the beast, and it's not that kind of problem.
Right.
And it also hasn't forgotten the crimes you committed to get here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, again, what Seymour does in this movie are crimes. Let's talk about the original ending, the
director's cut ending.
The director's cut, the one that's more faithful to the stage version. I did not know that this ending existed. I'm really grateful that you sent this to us separately, Alex. So really, very briefly, for anyone who's never seen the director's cut, which is closer to the stage version, Audrey dies. Instead of being saved by Seymour, she dies. She's like, you should feed me to the plant so that, we'll be together forever. So he feeds her body to the plant. And then Seymour gets the offer from Martin about, we're going to take Audrey 2 worldwide. And that's when Seymour's like, I got to destroy the plant. He doesn't. The plant eats Seymour. Everyone's dead. And then the final scene is there are Audrey 2s all over the country and the world is ending because they're eating everybody, which is a much, much darker ending. I'm not surprised that they didn't go with that for the theatrical release. But yeah, it felt truer to the story that they were telling, which is like the original cut is like maybe there's redemption at the end if you recognize the fault of your ways and make amends for all of the crimes you've committed for the sake of capitalism. But this director's cut is very much like, no, this thing's gonna kill you and everyone you love and will ultimately destroy the entire planet. So yeah,
it turns into Godzilla. And apparently this ending cost $5 million in and of itself. And guess David Geffen, did not want this to be the ending. And Frank Oz and Howard Ashman said, no, this has to be the ending and let's film it. And Geffen said, okay. And they filmed it and they tested it in New York and it tested so badly. The audience was with it up until the end. And then they just went stone cold when Audrey and Seymour died. And I think the percentage of will you recommend this movie was 13%. And they wanted to be above 50%. And then Ashman said, let's try it. Or Frank Oz said, let's try it in LA or on the West Coast. And they did. And the same thing happened. And at that point, the people had spoken in a way. And so they had to do this. And we could talk about what that means in terms of, the profit motive, but it perhaps would not have been released with that original ending. And so, what's a creator to do? They have to try something else. Yeah, I think it's so impressive. It goes on a little bit long, let's be honest, maybe, all the rampaging, but it is, amazing puppetry, amazing work, and it looks really, really cool. There's a couple of things I want to say about this. I think with the director's cut ending, the commodity fetish interpretation is much more satisfying because Audrey 2 becomes a commodity and is bought and sold by the general public, and we see everybody take it and say, oh, we all want this Audrey 2, and that transforms everything. And also, I guess we as an audience are implicated for having exchanged our money for a ticket to the movie, because the very, very final shot, of course, is the plant bursting through the screen, and coming to eat us, right? So we're buying the monster that fed on our labor. Capitalism is annihilating us. So I think that's all fun. I do really like this beat of Seymour going into the plant to destroy it, right? He tries to shoot it, I think, and rat poison. Some of this might be in the show and not the movie, but, he does some of these things. And then he takes a knife. He's going to cut it from the inside, right? And, we just see, like, his rage misdirected, maybe, at the instrument rather than the system. I guess this is really the machine theory of Audrey too. But just to think about, people who were replaced by machines in the 19th century sometimes directed their anger at the machines and destroyed them. Rivka, we just read this in chapter 15 of Capital. This what was sort of the origin of the Luddite movement, maybe, of people saying, that thing is responsible for me not having a livelihood, so let's get that thing, rather than the people, of course, who made the choice, the people who created the environment.
All that makes so much sense. I think the most radical thing they did in the end was to place that giant American flag right in between, because it made it quite clear. Like, to me, that was the most political point. And I wonder if they hadn't done that, if people would have reacted the way they did, because this is, like we said, this is Reagan's America. I mean, even something like that in the 60s or the 70s, you think people would probably find less of a danger to their political point of view, or what they are, how they think they should fall in line. But it made everything quite clear that, like, it implicated the United States in this destruction via Audrey 2 of the world. So in that sense, it had, like, imperialist implications as well. And I loved that. But I just wonder how it would have done testing wise, like, if that subtle, because it's a very big moment. And you have the 3 chorus members, Black women, singing in front of that, which I thought was also very radical, because we haven't touched on this quite. We touched on a little the racial dynamics of the film that don't feel as intentional, but are definitely felt, where it's very frustrating to see this is just a story about 2 white working class people who are totally unaware of any of that intersection, and seem to use a lot of the Black characters as, like, these magical Black characters who are narrating their experience and taking them through, and has this otherworldly wisdom, all of that stuff that I know has been. But then I did find there was something, I don't even want to say self-aware, but there was something seeing that image that felt like a wisdom I would appreciate, a radical wisdom of, like, yeah, this is what you fucking get. And then there is something that all of that changes when you're like, those 2 white characters who are in a lot of denial get eaten, and that I didn't read it as it's their own fault in terms of, like, a greedy individualistic thing. It's like the system will devour you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about the finale of the stage show, which is the song that is sung in the director's cut, which is "Don't Feed the Plants," right? And so that is the final sort of messaging that the show offers the audience, which, yeah, we can read as "don't be greedy." Maybe that's sort of the literal interpretation of that, which sounds then like individual advice for a systemic problem, possibly. I guess we could also see "Don't Feed the Plants" as a kind of call for action for solidarity. If the plants are capitalism, let's all gum up the works and let's stop that together. But I think that's something that I wrestle with. And if I were to direct a production, and if any artistic director or producer wants to produce a Marxist little shop, I'm available. But, that's something that I'm not sure about. Where would we land in terms of that? I think sometimes I feel a little bit unsatisfied in stage versions because, I don't know if I feel such a strong choice, beyond just the delight of it. And I will say that actually the stage version of the finale feels so different tonally from the movie version. And that was something that really surprised me coming back to watch the movie version director's cut, because there's just still so much silliness in that finale. The actors who are dead, they come back on stage, they have their faces in the blooms of the plant. And then there's a curtain call, which has a really important psychological function after a tragedy, as I think we've, referenced, that we see them come back and, oh, these people still are alive, and good. Oh, they're alive, And there's also room there's a clip in the playlist of this woman, Angel Jamat, in an international tour. And when they start singing, the three urchins, subsequent to the events you have just witnessed, unsuspecting jerks from Maine to California, yada, yada. Usually there's a descant, sort of an echo from one of them who just repeats like, have just witnessed, and just like hot riffing, California, stuff like that. And this actor, who was a Sesame Street person, I'm not going to do it, but you have to just watch that she just screams at the top of her lungs, all of those. And it's so jarring and destabilizing that now we're thinking about like what's happening on stage and these people, and like we're just thrown out of just the bleakness of it. And that, I don't know, it feels like clearly they made a very conscious choice in making the director's cut to really realistically, even in the confines of the constructed world, have this be scary and terrifying. And I guess that's the trade-off, for a movie versus the stage show.
Yeah, there's so many places to go with it. Please, someone fund this show, and Alex will direct.
The last thing I really wanted to talk about was just sort of the economics of the film and the stage show, and some of these other contradictions that we started to pull out about the business story around it, because the show was created to have a small cast so that it could run off-Broadway. They had written a show prior, Ashman and Menken, and it was too big. And Ashman said, no, let's make something small, and that can be successful. So it's always had a lo-fi, low-budget aesthetic. And yet it's like the commercial off-Broadway show. And this guy, Albert Poland, was a producer, general manager on the original production. And he writes in this memoir that ticket prices were raised during the off-Broadway run, and people were pissed because it was higher than off-Broadway was usually. And Poland felt really guilty about that. Now, this was the 80s. Probably that was like $40, And now this revival, these tickets are, very expensive. They can range from, I just looked at this last night, $80 on the lower end right now if you buy really far in advance to $300 like now,
Yeah.
And in the otherwise dead commercial off-Broadway space, right? Nonprofits really are the lifeblood of off-Broadway, and there really isn't this commercial thing anymore. It's just kind of, it's sort of gimmicky shows and what have you. So I don't know. I think we wrestle with that. I think the creators didn't set out to change the model for how shows happen in New York theater, but of course the content is what it is, and all these things that we're considering about the messaging there. I guess the film is another thing entirely because it retains a low-budget aesthetic, but it was a very high-budget movie for the time, considering, and it underperformed at the box office, but it made a killing in home sales. So it's like this big capitalist success that made a huge profit, even though market forces made them change the ending. So I guess I'm just trying to hold all those things in my head and think about the fact that, and I'm cribbing this from my collaborator, Jalen, and his work with the team, Rachel Chafkin's organization, that how we make is as important as what we make. And I just want to be intentional about that aspect too. Insofar as much we can control about it, the process is the product in some way.
I think that's really interesting. We talk about that a lot in different structures for filmmaking, but especially when it's such a wild contradiction when some of your favorite political films have contradictory backstories or what happens to them is contradictory. We've seen it with Squid Games we covered, or even, all the different things. And it's always coming back to that frustration of this bigger system, and we're all victims of it, and also have autonomy inside it to make choices and changes. So it's important to highlight all that. I had one question for you, Alex, because I do think it's interesting you did it inside of your Hebrew Day School. The other thing that I had read about it was there were some places early on that wouldn't show the movie because of the there are some anti-Semitic qualities. Mr. Mushnick is obviously, there's like moments there where you're like,
Yeah.
It's such a beloved part of like the New York, but you're just like, oh, you can't help but see. You're like, so the capitalist in this is the greedy Jewish man. Okay. But I'm curious if that was subverted at all when you did it in your Hebrew Day School.
Yeah, I have no memory of the actor who played Mushnick. I'm sure he was terrific. I think, I've read a little bit, I guess, of people talking about anti-Semitism with respect to Mushnick. And I don't know, the creators largely were Jewish, and I think it came out of like a Borscht Belt tradition. And, sometimes there just are these guys, even now, though fewer, there are these like middle-aged or older actors who come out of the Catskills sort of comedic tradition. And this is that role, they get to play this, it's kind of a satirical tevye, the song Mushnick and Son, which I mentioned, has a kind of phony klezmer sound to it. And so I think, I don't know, there's knowing mockery around this, maybe in the way that there's a sort of knowingness around some of the other characters. And it doesn't faze me so much. Also because, yeah, I think Mushnick is not so great and also is not the big bad of the show. Ultimately,
Yes.
he's just a part of it. He's just trying.
Yes. And Seymour, I also think, is Jewish, right?
His last name is Krellborn. So, yeah,
Krellborn.
I
Wow.
think maybe we read it as Jewish, possibly.
The other thing I'll say about Mushnick specifically and Vincent Gardenia's performance, I just saw Moonstruck for the first time recently, and he plays Cher's father in Moonstruck, and he plays an Italian American in that movie, and he is also hamming it up to the millionth degree in that movie. So like as much like as broad of a Jewish stereotype he's playing in this movie, he does the same thing in Moonstruck, but he's just like, oh, I'm an Italian American guy over here. Like it's so ridiculous and over the top. So I think it might just be Vincent Gardenia as a performer.
Possibly, but I will say Newsies, again, another one, had the same sort of trope.
For sure.
So it's good to put. They didn't do any prosthetics, so that's fine. I was curious about that since you said you did it at your day school.
Right.
But that's all. I mean, we really got deep into.
We dug deep into the soil of this movie. Wow, that got no response. Just
I wanted to let the comedy of it echo,
and Alex both
I give you a visual.
silently decided to just ignore it and just move right on. And you know what? It's understandable.
Shall we give this movie some awards?
Let's do it.
All right, Alex. So you've listened before. You know we like to give our own awards to this film. The first award we will be giving is Best Politics. This goes to the character with the best politics in this movie. I'm curious who you're going to give this to.
Yes, I would say the urchins. And I know you were just talking about them, and I think there's something complicated about them. But they have class consciousness, right? The bosses take your money and they break your hearts. You flag that, Frank. And, they're in it and they're outside of it, right? They're in the story and they comment on it. They have a sense of the bigger picture. I guess this is a half-formed thought, but they're named after a bunch of girl groups, doo-wop groups from the 50s, 60s, Ronettes, Crystals, Chiffons. So that's the name of the three characters. And I guess in a way, I feel like they haunt these characters, just the way that they had to navigate a largely white recording industry and had difficult experiences. And so to me, it feels like there's some wisdom that is infused in these characters who have been through it and they know it and they see it. You know, that's just something I'm thinking about right now.
I totally agree. And they're the ones that are telling Audrey to like get out of that relationship. They're like, you don't need to be dealing with that man. And you're right. I feel like they have the wisdom to know like we're not trying to deal with this fucking plant. Like we know that this plant is bad news. We know that this plant is just gonna like ruin these white people's days. So like we're just gonna stay out of the fray and just like comment on it.
They also have a great line when Mushnick is like, go to school, get off my stoop and go to school. And they're kind of just like, yeah, no, fuck school. Like that's part of the
better
system.
yourself.
Better
just
yourself.
So condescending.
So condescending. And maybe because we also read about like the role of school as coming out of like trying to like, they had to sort of educate some of the kids in the factory system so that they could make an excuse to put them into more labor. You know, they had to do it. But that's where like just the origins of schooling as it was, it felt like maybe they had a sense of, I was kind of like, yeah, that's bullshit. It was just a lot of like, this is bullshit. And musically, like, this would not be a musical without them.
Oh my God,
like,
yeah. They really
they really carry the show. So I'm with you. I can't think of another character. And I think that's also one of the strongest parts of this. There's not like a leading, I'm the hero. There is you could see how they might be pushing to do it for Seymour, but I appreciate like I found him so lame in this watch. And I like that. Like, oh no, I wouldn't trust you with anything. And I feel bad for him, but like
he's complicit.
And it's not his fault. Again, he was deeply abused his whole life.
Sure. Well, that brings us to the next award, which is worst politics. So who has the worst politics? It's not Seymour.
No.
It's probably the dentist.
Well, so obviously the dentist is abusive. He's also a bad boss and he punches his employees. Mm-hmm. I have to mention, this was another recent headline a couple months ago. Miriam Margolyes, beloved British actress and chat show host on The Graham Norton Show, if you ever watched that, she suggested that Steve Martin actually punched her when they were filming this movie. And that was like a headline. And then Steve Martin, he offered a statement and he was like, no, that didn't happen.
Oh.
You know, so I don't know anything more beyond that.
Great statement, bro.
Right. So that's just something in the air. So yes, of course, you could say the dentist. You could say Audrey 2, but I am partial to this reading that Audrey 2 is just reflecting capitalism back to us, or just taking advantage of the soil, if you will, Frank.
Thank you.
And so, yeah. And I wrote in my notes, I wrote, worst politics, ... man, question mark. So if that's not a cop-out, I would say man. And if it is, then the dentist.
Human, yeah, man, especially in this metaphor. But yeah, I guess for the sake of like having to name a character, I would say the dentist, just because he's an admitted, I don't even know how you would pathologize him. He loves causing people pain. He's a sadist.
He's a sadist.
He's a sadist who has found a career in causing people pain.
I guess if there was any rewrite, there's sort of a little bit of a lost opportunity with him, the way they do so well with all the other characters of like explaining the material circumstance and how they got there. Like everyone has a clear origin outside of themselves, and he's the only one that's like, he's a born sadist. He's a serial killer. And it doesn't really make sense in this world where there's so much about the class and like, where did he come from? Like you're like, no, he's more of a like Elon Musk creation. Like there's something more happening here than just he's, we have to fill in more blanks where the other characters we don't.
I think it's telling that we haven't talked about him until now, because he doesn't really have like much bearing on like this version of the story that we're talking about. He's just like, I'm just into pain, and that's it. There's no class-based commentary that his character offers. It's strictly just like, I'm a weird guy who loves hurting people. That's it.
Which is annoying because, like, I mean, I guess the point is, since he's Audrey 2's first victim after Seymour, but the first victim he, like, devours, we're sort of rooting for it because he is such a shitty guy. And he's more than a shitty guy, he's abusive and horrific. And so there's this sort of, well, I guess what was interesting, there was sort of in the killing of him, like a justification. And I think there's probably something to more unpack about like the neoliberal psychology here of like, we're the good guys. So Seymour can be the good guy. And, there's a reason that we want him to feed this evil guy to Audrey and it's okay, as opposed to being like, it's part of the system. But yeah, I wish there was more.
Right. And I think, there are questions to ask about like restorative justice or what have you, just because the plant says a lot of folks deserve to die, and Seymour is like, no, that's ridiculous. And then they're both, by the end of the song, like, yes, we're going to kill this guy. And, what do you do with a person like this? I think that is a legitimate question. Maybe it seems ridiculous, obviously, in the context of this show, but that's something that one could talk more about, I suppose.
All right. Our last award, Best Supporting / Spinoff, meaning the character that we want to actually know more about or that this movie should be about.
Yes, I think a great spinoff would follow Bill Murray's horny, masochistic freak character, who is just sort of strange and delightful. I think he is playing this role that Jack Nicholson originated in the original Roger Corman film and is not part of the stage show at all, which is understandable because it has nothing to do with it, except that it's just funny to watch Bill Murray do this. And apparently he improvised this whole thing. He asked Frank Oz, do I have to read the script? And Frank Oz said, no, that's okay. And so Steve Martin is doing lines from the script, and then Bill Murray's wiggling all over the place and doing whatever the hell he wants. And then Steve Martin says a line from the script, and on and on and on. So anyway, it has a spark of spontaneity to it. And I'd like to know more about him.
Yeah, I'm just interested in like the dude who gets horny going to the dentist. Like, tell me that story. Let's dive into that psychology. So yeah, that was gonna be my vote as well.
I want to know more about, I guess you said the urchins. Is that what they're called? The chorus?
Yes.
Yeah. I think I would want to see the version of they sing the song and then what's happening when they're not singing. Just like all the commentary that they're not maybe being forced labor to do. Like I feel like there's the version of the song they have to sing and then the reality happening. I would want to see that version.
Yeah, totally.
Also, I would love to see Audrey 2's origin story. I like to think there's like something about Audrey 2 where Audrey 2 is part of a bigger system as well and like not actually enjoying their role in all of this either. Like, where did they come from? Is it some kind? Yeah,
is it an alien race and they chose this person, entity, alien thing to be the first one to come down because they had a special set of skills or what have you. There's a lot of interesting backstory to tease out there.
Also, real quick shout out to Levi Stubbs of the Four Tops?
The Four Tops.
Of the Four Tops, who voiced Audrey 2, which I was gobsmacked by this voice performance. I was like, this is one of the best voice performances of all time, full stop. Like the range, and not just the singing, but like even in his like dialogue delivery, I was like, why do we not talk about Levi Stubbs more? This is unbelievable. So that's it.
Yes, and in interviews, he's like, yeah, it was fun. I don't want to do movies. I did that one movie. That was fun. That was it.
Super anti-capitalist, actually.
I suppose.
Yeah, it's just like walked away from it. Incredible. Alex, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for choosing this. Thank you for coming with your like wide breadth of knowledge. I love this conversation. But before we wrap, the last thing we like to do is ask our guests how they practice their anti-capitalist values in their day-to-day life. So that could be anything from like a practice you engage in to an organization you work with. So yeah, what do you do?
Well, I think I'm just going to hit one more time the value of reading groups, of looking at theory and then trying to turn that into praxis. And I'll put a plug in for anti-capitalism for artists, because I think, just based on the conversations that we've been having with Chris, I think he has a lot of ambition around what organizing in the arts could look like. And that this reading group that we're a part of, once we're done with it, which will be sort of end of April, will lead to something larger, some sort of campaign, what have you, and probably an outgrowth of this organization that is doing, really interesting work, just sort of raising consciousness and getting us to think about actionable things, getting us to organize rather than mobilize. And so, I want to, continue to follow that. And, I just think it's really fun to take a book that you are intrigued by, but seems really hard, and just say, all right, well, can I find a couple people and just do this together? I think that I would encourage anybody who is intimidated by a book, but drawn to it, to, gather a little reading group and muscle through it, because I think, it's easy to put it off and say, oh, I'll get to that at some point. I have all of these other priorities. But I guess I have found that reading some of these texts with other people just has been very valuable and very important to me and changed my way of thinking. So if we can rearrange our priorities and say, oh, reading some of this stuff is really, really essential to our being, we can prioritize it better and see where it leads in terms of action.
I love that.
That's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Where can our audience find you if they'd like to?
Yes, I'm on Instagram. It's at Alex Lee Hare. And, just kicking around the theater district sometimes here. Might have to move to Brooklyn at some point. You could find me in Brooklyn, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, would be tragic. No, we'd welcome you with open arms. Alex, it was great meeting you. Thank you so much again for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
It was a blast.
Thank you all so much for listening, and make sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to support the show and get access to our premium episodes, you can do so by going to mvcpod.com to subscribe to our Patreon.
For next week's movie, we will be watching the 1998 Robert Zemeckis live-action animation hybrid feature film, Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.